Hello everybody, in this video we're going to give an introduction to versioning with Temporal. Versioning has to do with dealing with change, and no matter what kind of software applications you're writing, you probably encounter at least one different versioning system, and they all behave differently. In this video we're going to focus on versioning of workflows, and we're going to give introduction of the typical ways of versioning workflows or more traditional ways and talk about their problems. Then we're going to introduce how Temporal deals with versioning and dealing with changes in your workflows. And in the end, we're going to show a demo that shows kind of everything that we're going to talk about. Typically, when we talk about versioning workflows, we talk about versioning the entire workflow. So with workflows, we start off with a workflow definition. The workflow definition can be written, in different types of formats like XML, form-based, DSL-based, and also, of course, like with Temporal in programming languages. From the workflow definition, which represents our business requirements, we can create one or many different workflow instances which represent the executions of our workflow. A typical way with versioning workflows is that we brand the whole workflow definition with a particular version. In case, let's say here, V1. This really means that no matter how many workflow instances we create, each one is going to be branded with that particular version. Now, what does it mean in terms of change? What if we have to update or make changes to our workflow definition? So we start off with a workflow definition, which was the entire thing was set with or branded with version 1. And let's say we have a bunch of workflow instances which are also running against that version 1 of our workflow definition. So at some point, we want to introduce some change. So we have to define a new workflow definition and set it as version 2, for example. Now, this means that now we have 2 workflow definitions, which we have to test independently. But regardless, we have to wait for all the workflow instances of version 1 to complete, right? Then we want to undeploy our old workflow definition. We want to deploy, we have to deploy our new workflow definition under version 2. And now we can start workflow instances that include all the different changes which we introduced in the version 2 of our workflow definition. This approach is okay for short-running workflows. Short-running workflows meaning workflows that execute in a very short amount of time. If we have workflows that run for maybe a couple minutes and things like that, we can really have that are running on some sort of infrastructure, such as some sort of form of clusters or the deployment that we have for a production system. We can simply wait, let's say in this case, 5 minutes for these workflows instances to complete. And then we can deploy our new version of the workflow and start new instances against the second workflow version or definition, which includes our changes. Now, this fails miserably when we talk about long-running workflows. When we're dealing with workflows in general, we're representing our business requirements. A lot of times, our workflows run for weeks, months, and even years. In those cases, this approach that we showed before does not really work, and here I'm going to explain why. Let's say we have a workflow definition of V1, which runs on some sort of infrastructure or production infrastructure, and we have a bunch of instances that are running under that version. And in this case, let's say that our workflow is a long-running workflow for that runs about 10 months. At some point in time in between now and 10 months, let's say after a couple months, we want to introduce a change. In this case, using this approach of versioning the entire workflow definition runs into the problem that in order to set up our changes or to introduce our changes, we have to deploy them really on a whole new set of infrastructure. We cannot wait for the old workflow instances to complete because they are long-running. So we have to set up for maybe a new cluster, a new whatever your deployment system is, and start running new instances against our workflow definition version 2. And you see the problem for long-running workflows. Let's say after a couple months after we introduced version 2, we have to introduce some new changes or fixes to our code. And again, we end up in a problem of setting up more and more types of infrastructure, more places. This also leads into having to do some sort of load balancing between the different infrastructures. They're running different versions of the workflows. And it just becomes a big mess. And in addition, introduces a large cost factor to actually be able to running this and using this versioning approach. So when you look at a lot of different workflow runtimes, in order to deal with this issue of having to replicate your production system or running different workflows on different types of infrastructures or different versions of workflows, a lot of runtimes came up with this approach of workflow migration. What that means is that we have, let's say, a workflow definition version 1 and workflow definition version 2. In addition to that, we have to define some sort of mapping instructions or migration instructions. Those can be represented, let's say, some sort of JSON format, or there can be a programming language API that a particular runtime provides. But that provides the mapping between changes, or you can think of it as a diff between the workflow definitions that have the different versions in this case. So what does that mean? So this kind of solves the problem of having to replicate or running different versions on different infrastructures, but introduces some other problems. Here we, for example, see our workflows running version 1, 2, and 3, and we have to at runtime be able to map from version v1 to v2 using these mapping instructions. Let's say then we also have to maintain the mapping between version v2 and v3. But as we add more versions or more changes that are required for our business to run, we have to also start maintaining, for example, mappings between version v1 and v3. And you can see this scales, the complexity of this scales indefinitely. So this approach of workflow migration is, number one, very hard to define. You not only have to maintain and test multiple versions of your workflow, but you also have to maintain and test your mappings. And it's very, very difficult to test and debug especially. So let's, now that we have seen kind of the issues with more of the traditional approaches of versioning workflows, let's take a look how Temporal solves this problem. With Temporal, we don't version the workflow. We version changes in the workflow. So let's kind of try to explain that. In order to explain versioning with workflow, we have to first start talking about or introduce on a high level what does determinism mean with workflows in Temporal. So the way to kind of introduce that is on our workflow instance, which represents the executional workflow definition, runs through some sort of steps or the code that you define that needs to be executed in your workflows. Each particular step in your code or in your workflow you can see as commands. On the left-hand side, we see, for example, a workflow instance, which currently has executed, let's say, pieces of code that represent command 1, 2, and 3. Whenever the execution of a workflow comes to a block, meaning that we need the temporal server to give us some sort of instructions how to proceed, or, for example, create some timers or schedule invocations of our activities or child workflows, this workflow worker, which is responsible for this workflow instance, picks up the commands and sends them to the temporal server. The temporal server then can, do things like dynamically generate, for example, timers and store the current state of our workflow in the database and things like that. Whenever the temporal server has done all that and is and says, okay, now we can proceed execution of a workflow, it puts a workflow task on a task queue. Now, this workflow task is now picked up by a worker, and Temporal being a distributed system, it can be a completely different worker than the one that actually sent the commands for our execution to the Temporal server. The worker is going to read the workflow task, which includes a lot of things like events that allow us to restore the current state of our workflow execution before those commands were sent to the server, and instructions on how to proceed the execution of the workflow instance. As part of that, or restoration of the state, Temporal does a check, which means it's going to compare all the so far executed commands with the actual events that have happened or should have happened so far in order to be able to restore the state in the same state as with the workflows before in order to continue execution. If those commands match and events match, then the workflow is said to be deterministic and can proceed execution. However, if for some reason, if we added some change to our workflow or changed our workflow code, this mapping fails, our workflow execution is not deterministic, and the workflow execution is going to stop with some non-deterministic error. So what does that mean in order for workflows and versioning and dealing with changes? Because in order to find if a workflow is deterministic, we only check what has so far been executed. This really means, kind of we can say, okay, we can always make changes to the parts of code which haven't executed yet. So for example, let's say we have a code here and the circles in dark blue color represent particular codes and commands in our workflow definition which so far has executed. And the light blue circles means code that hasn't executed yet. So, we can say, fine, why do we even care about versioning? We can just go ahead and introduce a change to our workflow in parts of the code that haven't executed yet, and we should be fine. And yes, if you have a single workflow instance and you know exactly where it is during workflow execution, you can probably do that. But the reality of things is that we don't have a single workflow instance. In a real applications, we might have tens, hundreds, or thousands of workflow instances running, and each one can be in a different type of path or location of where it's currently executing. So in this slide, we show, for example, 5 workflow instances, and each one is a different stage or part of workflow execution. Again, the dark blue circles representing code that has executed so far, and the light blue circles meaning the code that hasn't yet. So let's say we want to introduce some changes. Let's say change A and change B to our code. For change A, we see that, okay, this code would work for instance 3 and 4 because it's placed at a location of the code that hasn't really executed yet. But this would break the determinism of instance 1, 2, and 5. Similarly, change B in this case would work for instance 1, 3, and 4, but it would definitely break the determinism of workflow instance 2 and 5. So I'm showing this to showcase that we cannot simply just add changes to our workflow and assume that everything will run fine. So what Temporal does is it versions changes, and a workflow change has 2 properties. One is the change ID, which is a unique identifier of the change, and then this change has a version range. And we'll talk about that in a minute in a future slide. But what does this mean? This means that really, if we have any sort of workflow instance, and the yellow circles really represent that we don't really know what has executed so far and which one hasn't, and we want to introduce that change, by having the ability to introduce a change, giving it a change ID and a version range means that, for example, for workflows, in this case, let's say we have a workflow instance which has passed the point to where we're making a change. It will still maintain its determinism because it can take the path that it took before, ignoring basically the changes that we have made. But also for workflow instances that haven't executed this code yet, where we introduce the change, are able to then take the path that includes the change and actually apply it during execution. So what is a change, or what is a change to the workflow that we're talking about? A change really, like we said, has a change ID and has a version range. And if we look at code, this is Go code, but when we introduce a change, we have to utilize this workflow.get version. And this method particularly takes a change ID, which in this case is foo change, which is the ID or particular unique identifier of our change. And then we define a range. There is a special range called workflow.default version. Default version really means it's a path for the code, or even during replay or checking the determinism of the workflow, which hasn't had a change yet. And then the max supported version is all the different versions range up to 2, for example. So in this case, our change supports the default version, which is workflows that haven't received this change yet, version 1 of this change, but also up to version 2 of this change. And if we see underneath that in the if-else statements, we can determine the path or the execution of our workflow given the version. So if the workflow is in default version, meaning that's workflows that have passed execution of where this change was introduced, they would still, execute the activity foo. But if workflows that have been executed using the version 1 of this change will execute, the activity bar. And in case workflows that haven't executed this change yet and get the max supported version of 2 are going to execute the activity BAS in this case. Another thing that we can do with temporal and workflow changes is we can coordinate them. A lot of times we don't just want to make a change in a single place. Given maybe large workflow definitions, sometimes we have to make changes in multiple places. So what Temporal allows you to do is to do that. In this case, we want to introduce a change to multiple places in our workflow, and we can then use the same change ID in order to associate those two changes as being done together. Now, once a change is done, does it mean we cannot change that piece of code again? With Temporal, yes, you can. In this case, what we have is we introduce a change with, let's say, a change ID AA and a version range of default to 1, meaning that we support workflows before the change and this particular change up to version 1. Then let's say later on, we realized, okay, we have to make further changes to this piece of code, or in this case, the orange circle that represents the change that we introduced in our workflow. We can do that. We can then still maintain the change ID of AA, but we can add a new range or the max range of our change version, which is 2. And now we have support for not only the workflows that without the change, so not to break their determinism, but also workflows that have been executed with our change ID AA and version 1, but as well as also new workflows, instances that haven't executed this path yet and actually going to take the max version of version 2 of this change. Now, you can see that this can grow indefinitely. And if we look at the code that we looked before, that really adds a ton of code to our workflow definition that we have to change. So what can you do about that? If we know that all of our currently running workflow instances have passed version 1 already, then we no longer have to, in our code, maintain the default or path of our version of our change. In this case, what we can do is we can change the version range of our change to 1 to 2, meaning that we only support workflows now or instances, during replay and stuff that have been either executed with our change ID AA and version 1 or version 2 of this particular change. Now you may ask, okay, how do we know that? I mean, I might have thousands of workflow instances running. How can I know it when it is actually safe or possible even to remove, let's say in this case, like we did the default version and support only parts or certain versions of our changes? Temporal allows you to query workflows by their actual change that were introduced. So this can be done in two ways, via Temporal CLI or TCTL. And here we can see a command that does TCTL workflow count. So we're going to count the number of workflows that have this particular search attribute temporal change version and its value to the change ID of the change and dash the version of the change. And we add here and execution status equals 1, meaning that we only want to query workflows that are currently running. Now, temporal change version is a search attribute, and temporal is going to update it whenever it sees a particular change in our workflow and given its change ID and version. Now, for this to run, of course, you have on the temporal server to enable Elasticsearch. And this is the same as with any other search attributes in temporal. The second query with using the CLI is just TCTL workflow list, which is going to list us all the workflows that are currently running and they have the temporal change version set to the value of change ID dash version. Another way is you can query workflows by change is via the temporal web UI. And here you can just query some workflows and use the same query that we used in the CLI, and the web UI is going to show all the different workflows that are currently running and have been tagged with that particular change ID and version. Now, of course, this is great, and we talked about how we can actually change workflows and things like that. But a very important thing about doing any sort of changes is being able to test them. And this is what we previously talked about was very hard to do with the more traditional types of approaches. With temporal, being able to test changes in a workflow is actually fairly easy and intuitive, and allows you to actually be very confident that when you redeploy your workflow, which contains changes, that is actually not going to break any existing instances running. So we start off with our workflow definition, and of course we want to run unit tests against that in order to assure that it is running the way we want it. Now, and another thing that we can do, we can run this workflow, let's say in production or test environment or whatever, and via both the CLI and the temporal web UI, we can get its event history JSON. Now, this JSON represents, it's kind of like the same information that we showed before on a slide that the worker is going to use to check the determinism of our workflow definition. So once we switch or add some changes to our workflow definition, so this is now our workflow, which includes some of the changes we have added to it. Of course, now we want to run a set of unit tests against it to make sure that it itself behaves the way it should. But in addition, Temporal for both Java and the Go SDKs provides a class or workflow replayer, which allows us to take in this event history JSON and replay it and make sure that those instances that are still running, which haven't picked up the changes in the workflow definition, are still going to be fine during workflow replay, and it's not going to break their determinism. So once we've done that, we were pretty confident that we can deploy our workflow that includes these changes into production, and it will not break the determinism of any of the existing running workflow instances. So to kind of tie it back together, we talked earlier about the issues with more traditional approaches of versioning with workflows. We talked about how sometimes it's hard to deal with long-running workflows, and it also requires in many cases running multiple versions of workflows on different types of infrastructures and setup, and how that create, we talked about the difficulties with providing this mapping type of structures between versions of workflows and stuff like that. And now let's see how Temporal actually solves that. So with our workflow definition that is deployed, and there's a bunch of workflow instances running against it, when we introduce a change and redeploy this particular workflow definition, all the instances running are going to include that change, right? And when we keep adding changes to it, all the instances are going to get those changes as well. So if you see, Temporal solves a lot of the issues with actually versioning workflows in general. Now, the next part is, let's actually take a look at the demo and see how this actually works. And in the demo, we're going to use the Go SDK, and you can find the code and run it yourself on GitHub. And here the version or the URL, GitHub URL for that. If you're working with Java, I've created the same demo, but using the Temporal Java SDK, and here's the URL for that as well. For the demo part, here we have a customer workflow. It's basically a long-running workflow which rewards customers. So after being a customer for a long period of time, we want to reward that particular customer, let's say with $100. So the workflow executes first this get customer account activity to get the customer information, waits for a bit, and then updates the customer account, adding the particular bonus specified here to their account. So that is our long-running workflow that we want to then start and then apply some changes to it. So let's go ahead and go to the worker. Go ahead and start the worker that has this particular workflow and all its activities registered. So then we can go to the starter directory here and start an instance of our workflow. For the demo purposes, we're just going to start one, but in kind of real life applications, you will have many of those running depending on how many customers you have available. So let's go ahead and start an instance of this workflow. If we go to our web UI, let's go look at the last 10 minutes, we can see the workflow is running. We can, look at its history and see it's currently in a timer started and in wait period. So let's see, after some amount of time, we want to go ahead and make changes to our workflow. So the first change that we're going to make is we're going to add a change with the ID added check with the change version range of default workflows. So we will support workflows that are currently running without the change, and also the max supported version of this change of 1. And this one is just going to check the customer account. So we wanted to add something that checks our customer account first to make sure that when we apply the bonus, that is still a customer. So let's go ahead to the worker and restart it. This will apply this particular change to our currently running workflow. And here we can actually run a query that says temporal, and I have it here already. Wait, did we call it add a check? Yes, and it hasn't gotten to it yet, but we can run this query again. And hopefully after the wait, our change will be applied, and we will show here, and we will see that we have temporal change version at check one, and we have one workflow running that has applied the particular change. Now what we want to do is, after some time again, we want to add more changes to our workflow. In this case, the first change that we want to do is change the bonus after a couple months. Let's say our business has changed, our model has changed, and we actually want to reward our customers $200. So we applied a synchronous change where it gets applied in two places. The first thing we want to do is change the bonus to 200. Now this is only going to be done for workflow instances, again, that haven't executed this particular piece of code yet. And here, as part of the change now, we also want, after we update the customer account, send them an email telling them they have received a bonus of now $200. So let's go ahead and on the worker apply this change again. So now if we see our workflow is still running, it is currently in, again, firing on our 2-minute timer. It has completed. And if we look back at our queries, and we see that we can also check it for our change called added bonus. And in this case, our workflow instance is already completed, but we do have a workflow that was tagged with the temporal change version added bonus 1. And if we look back at our workflow execution, it has completed. So our starter has completed the execution. And we see that initially, of course, when we started our workflow instance, our bonus was 100. We introduced 2 changes to the workflow. And in the end, both of them were picked up in this case for the demo. And the result of how much money was added to the customer account was the change that we applied after, with the changes that we introduced after we initially started our workflow. So that's it for the demo. I hope you liked it. Now, this is just an introduction to versioning. There is a lot more things to cover here, maybe just things like edge cases and stuff like that. And we do want to create follow-up videos on versioning that kind of go in more depth about all of that stuff. For now, that's it. I hope you enjoyed it and have a great day.